All right, so now we're going to move to Chapter 11, where we're going to start addressing the whole area about leadership, leadership fundamentals, and leadership behavior. Some of the learning objectives for this chapter is, first of all, again, we define what leadership means, why managers prefer a particular situational leadership theory. We'll be talking about all the theories. We'll discuss whether leaders are really needed in work settings, which is, I don't know why they're debating it, but that's one thing that we'll be discussing. We're going to compare a situational theory, situational factors used in discussions, and we'll talk about contingency and path goal approaches to leadership. And we're going to look at some assumptions that followers make about path goal and the leader-member exchange theory. What is leadership? Well, do we have a push style of leadership or do we have a pull style of leadership, where a leader has to push someone to get the job done or pull them along to accomplish a task? This goes back a little bit to our Theory X and Theory Y, where we make assumptions about whether employees need to be closely supervised in order to get the job done or allowed a certain amount of freedom, and assuming that they're motivated because of reward systems to get the job done. Leaders influence others to do what they might not otherwise do on their own. Leaders should be agents of change. They should help encourage goals. They should, the acts that they have should influence others more than the acts of others influence them. In terms of leadership effectiveness, leaders are going to have to deal with goals of individuals, groups, and the organization, and some of those are not always in alignment. Leader effectiveness is typically measured by whether the leader gets the goals accomplished or not. In terms of acceptance of a leader's directives, this rests pretty much on what the expectations of the followers are, and that they have a favorable response to the leader, and that they are willing to accomplish the particular goal and achieve the outcomes. When we look at a framework for studying leadership, we break it down into these 4 different areas. First of all, we want to look at the traits of a leader, what kind of abilities, what their personality has, how they're motivated. And then we look at things like their behavior, how they accomplish tasks, how they are oriented towards people, whether they initiate a certain type of orientation towards the job and the structure of the job, how they consider employees, whether they look at it in terms of transactions, and how they become transformational in terms of how they change the organization. There's also situational variables that might sometimes be within their control or not, such as the needs of the followers, what that task is, what's going on in terms of how much position power they have as a leader, and then what happens if the group is even ready and prepared to accomplish and achieve those goals. These things combined actually help look at effective results. Again, we said leaders are measured by their outcomes and whether they accomplish goals. How well they've done production, the quality of the work, how efficient they've been, how flexible they've been, how satisfied their customers and employees are, the competitiveness of the organization in which the leader operates, and how the ongoing survival of the organization is sustained. One of the theories that has been very popular in leadership has to do with trait theory. And it basically says that it's the characteristics about the leader that indicates whether the leader is going to be successful. And these often include what kind of physical attributes they have. Like there was a time when they actually said someone who was taller or someone who was more attractive was going to be a better leader than others. Whether they're born with a certain level of intelligence and whether they have a certain personality. Basically, trait theory says that they're basically born with these kinds of traits and they're not as easy to change. In terms of personality, you'll see in this particular slide, they define it by how much energy they have, how able they are to tolerate stress, how their level of integrity, how their emotional maturity. It also looks at their motivation, how well they oriented towards socialization of their power, how strongly they have a need for achievement, which we talked about in our motivational chapter, how persuasive they are in their ability to influence others to get jobs accomplished. Also, it turns out that it's also dependent on their abilities, that what are their interpersonal skills, what are their thinking skills, how capable are they technically, and can they supervise other people in order to lead them and motivate them to get the job done. When we study leadership behavior, we look at several things. First of all, what do leaders do in relation to accomplishing the task? And we call this job-centered, when they're focusing pretty much on the task and how that is accomplished. We also look at what they do to maintain the relationships with people doing the task, and in this case we call this employee-centered. And we look at leadership behavior in terms of whether they are task-oriented or relationship-oriented. In terms of the effectiveness criteria, some of the things that they're measured by has to do with productivity measures, job satisfaction. A lot of organizations administer job satisfaction surveys yearly and track that. What the level of turnover is in the organization, grievances, what the costs are of certain situations in terms of the abilities of the employees. Things, when you're in a production organization, how much scrap loss, material, and whether you experience a level of motivation from the employees and the managers. When we have a job-centered leader, the characteristics that we see in terms of their behavior is they focus on the task. How do we get the task done? They closely supervise, and they're very specific about procedures. Oftentimes, their behavior is also characterized by perhaps that they coerce others to do something. They link a reward system very directly to that accomplishment of the task. They have to have legitimate power, like to be a leader in that particular area, to influence the behavior and the performance of the employee. When we look at an employee-centered leader, we're looking at someone who tends to have more focus on relationships with people, getting the job done. They tend to exhibit their leadership by actually delegating some of the decision-making to others and being a little less hands-on. They tend to be more concerned with, when we're looking at motivation, Hertzberg's theory of having more job satisfaction, so the things that motivate people by advancement, growth, achievement. In terms of these behavioral theories of job-centered versus employee-centered, we often also call it the initiating structure. So you'll see or hear that term sometimes. When we have the job-centered, that task-oriented, they organize and define the relationships within the group. They have well-defined patterns and channels of communication that need to be followed, and they have very specific job descriptions and ways in which a job has to be done. When you have an employee-centered environment that tends to be what they call more consideration-oriented, the relationships between the leader and the employees tends to be more built on respect, trust, friendship, rapport, and oftentimes the followers have more leeway in terms of how they go about doing the job. Some of the shortcomings of these particular theories is the linkage between leadership and performance isn't always that conclusively resolved. There's a lot of research in this area about leader behavior versus performance outcome. Also, we have external factors that are often called environmental factors, in which maybe the leader doesn't have any, like the stock market changing or a global environmental disaster or something that the leader really doesn't have any control over, and that might influence the behavior in organizations. So the situational variables are sometimes not considered. In situational theories of leadership, which we'll be talking about, these theories suggest that in situational theories of leadership, these theories suggest that the leadership effectiveness actually depends on this person fit. So we're looking at personality, the power that they have, their perceptions, and how that relates in the situation. In situational theory, it advocates that the leader has to understand their own behavior, and in order to do that, they'll adapt to the behavior of the subordinates. And it also requires a leader to have really good diagnostic skills and really being able to assess and understanding the behavior of the people that work with them. In terms of situational theory, some of the key factors about this that you should pay attention to is that managers will adapt to and modify their leadership style to deal with different kinds of factors within the organization, some coming from managers, subordinates, or the situation. So that's why they call it situational. Now in contingency, we look at the group performance is dependent on the interaction between the leaders and the situational favorableness. So it's the behavior is contingent upon what's going on in the assessment. Leadership styles tend to have task-oriented leadership or relationship-oriented leadership, which we were talking a few minutes ago about being job-centered or employee-centered. Some of the situational factors have to do with what are the relationships between the leader and the members of the group, what is the task, and what's the power of the person that's in the leadership position. You can look at this particular slide on situational favorableness that looks at a number of different situations in terms of what's going on between the leader and the members of the organization. Do they have good relationships or poor relationships? How structured is the task? How much power the leader has within the organization? And then you can take a look at, then you design basically leadership behavior. So, you know, when you have task-oriented or relationship-oriented behavior, you can take a look at these particular situations to say what might work best in terms of performance outcomes. In terms of changing the situation to fit the leaders, they talk about this leadership member, or I think they use in the term book LMX. They spend, the leader does modify their behavior in regards to what's going on within the members of the organization. They'll either spend more or less time informally with their subordinates. They'll actually try to ask for certain people to be in their group because of the kinds of relationships they have. They will volunteer to direct difficult or troublesome subordinates. They are also able to raise morale by obtaining more positive outcomes for certain subordinates that might have difficulties with other type of leadership styles. In changing the situation to fit the leaders, we want to modify task structure. So here's some suggestions to work with less structured tasks. Maybe as a leader or as an employee, you would ask the boss to give you something new or something unusual of a problem to solve. You might bring those problems to the group and ask them to help solve them and contribute to the planning and decision making. The research has shown that when people are more involved in group decision making, that they tend to have more productive performance outcomes. When you have really highly structured tasks, you might ask for more structured tasks or more detailed instructions. So you might need something that has more specific details to how it's being done. And you might break the job into different little subtasks that can be more structured so that people can understand and execute the job appropriately. In terms of modifying your position power, so here's some suggestions here. If you're in a leadership position where you need to raise your position power, you might want to exercise your power that the organization sort of has given you. Sometimes leaders don't use that unless they really do need to in times to say, hey, this is my authority, this is my position. And also you might want to channel and control information through you. We did talk in the power chapter that information is power. And if information can only be gotten through you, then that will definitely raise your position power. If you want to lower your position power, then what you do is you just allow you become more democratic in your decision making with your employees and the group members, and you allow them to participate more in the planning and decision making, and you let other people exercise more power in terms of how the execution of the work is done. Another theory defined in your book has to do with House's path-goal leadership model. And this says that leaders are effective because of their impact on followers in terms of their motivation, ability to perform, and their satisfaction. And this model focuses on how leaders influence the followers' perceptions of the quality of the work goals, how they can develop themselves, and what kind of path they need to follow in order to accomplish the goal. There's different behaviors that leaders exhibit when they're following a path-goal style of leadership. How directive they are, how supportive they are of their employees, how much they include people and participatively, and how they design tasks and work around achievement and accomplishment. In path goal leadership theory, the leadership behavior is effective to the extent that the employees perceive that the behavior of the leader is a source towards their satisfaction and accomplishment. It's also motivational if it makes the satisfaction of the subordinates' needs contingent upon effective performance. So this is a theory that's oriented towards performance outcome. So the leader needs to provide guidance, direction, and appropriate rewards in order to enable effective performance outcomes. When we look at path goal theory, here's a nice little model that summarizes it. We're summarizing the fact that the behaviors that they might use are directive, supportive, participative, and achievement-oriented. Again, we look at the followers, how much control they need, how much experience they have, and whether their capabilities. And then we look at external factors or environmental factors within the organization, such as the structure of the work group, how formal the authority is, and what is the nature of the task. And then the followers have perceptions of these, and that contributes towards their motivation in terms of how it's executed, so that whether they achieve the performance and are satisfied with the outcomes. In terms of path goal situational factors, we have contingency variables that relate to the characteristics of the subordinates. So in different groups we have perceptions, and some people think some leaders are better than others, and a lot of it's around perception. We have locus of control in terms of what is the control factor of the leader or the perception that the subordinate may have. We have what we've termed environmental factors that have to do with the nature of the task, the structure of the organization, and the design of the work team. A leader who helps reduce the uncertainties of the job for employees is often called a motivator. And what they do is they increase the expectations of the subordinates so that their efforts to lead to more desirable rewards, that they feel like if they, we're actually going back to a little bit of expectancy theory that we talked about in motivation, and saying, if I expect to be able to do this work and I have the knowledge, skills, and abilities, then I'm going to do it, and it's going to lead to my desire, the outcome, and then I'll be rewarded. Situational leadership theory, the emphasis is on the follower and the maturity of the follower. And the leader needs to judge how mature the follower level is, and then what they do is they use a certain appropriate leadership styles that help the follower accomplish the job and help motivate him. Readiness is also the ability and willingness of the follower to take responsibility for directing their own behavior. So the follower might be mature in a certain way, but they also need to be ready to take on job responsibility, both job readiness and also psychologically ready. Hersey Blanchard developed the different leadership styles that go with situational leadership. You'll see a model in the book and in one of our slides here about when you have a subordinate that is not particularly mature or have the skills for the job, you end up using a telling style. When they have skills but they're not particularly motivated, you use a selling style. And then so forth in terms of whether you use a more participative, inclusive style if someone is motivated and maybe they're developing their skills. And if you know they have skills and motivation, then you delegate. Here's an example of that when you look at R1 and S1. So whether they're unable or unwilling, then you tend to have a telling, and then you tend to be more supervisory and close contact with helping them through the job. When you have the next level of unable but willing, then you tend to use a selling style, like I said. When you have another level, when they're able but they're not exactly motivated or willing, then you use more of a participative style. You get them involved in decision makings. And when they're able and willing, you just coach them and send them on their way. In the leader-member exchange theory model, this also has different leader behavior across subordinates. And it's built on relationships, and each relationship is unique. It tends to be one-on-one with the subordinate, and that determines the leader's behavior. Usually they classify subordinates into groups, either the in-group or the out-group, which is also defined in your book and in one of our slides here. Here we have in-group members. They have a common bond. They interact regularly. They get the best assignments. They're more positive. They have a higher performance satisfaction. People that are considered out-group, they don't have things as common with the leader. They don't interact with the leader as much. Their job responsibilities don't tend to be as challenging. They tend to get bored, and lots of times these people leave the organization. In the next couple slides, we're going to be comparing the different situational approaches. We have we have contingency approach, where the leader qualities are based on task or relationship. We have the path goal approach, where you can help apply proper motivational theories to have the employees follow an effective way of work in order to accomplish the goal. We have the situational leadership, where we look at the terms and the style of leadership in terms of task and relationship based on the follower's maturity. And we have the leader membership exchange that's based on not any consistent behavior, but the relationship between the leader and certain members of in-group, out-group of an organization. We have assumptions about the followers in each one of these models. In contingency theory, the assumption about followers is that they prefer different leadership styles. In path goal, we that they have different needs that must be fulfilled that the leader helps them do. In situational theory, we look at the maturity or readiness factor in the follower. And the leader-member exchange, we end up looking at it in terms of are they in the in-group or in the out-group in terms of the organization. In terms of the leadership effectiveness and contingency theory, that's determined by the interaction of the environment and the personality factors. In path goal, effective leaders tend to clarify for the followers the path that will lead to their rewards and the best outcomes. In situational theory, leaders adapt by directing, coaching, supporting the different styles that we talked about in that theory in order to fit the followers' levels of maturity. And in the leader-member exchange, they adapt to the style to fit the followers' needs.